May 8, 1943, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The mess hall door swung open at 1800 hours, releasing the smell of grilled meat into the prairie wind. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, formerly of Rommel's 21st Panzer Division, captured at Kasserine Pass 3 months earlier, stood in the food line holding a metal tray. The American cook, a corporal from Ohio who spoke no German, placed something on Weber's plate that shouldn't have existed: a hamburger. Ground beef on a soft white bun, garnished with pickles, onions, and a slice of tomato. Next to it, a handful of French fries. Behind Weber, 200 German prisoners waited their turn, staring at the same incomprehensible meal. Weber had spent 14 weeks in American captivity. He'd been interrogated, processed, transported across an ocean, and confined behind barbed wire in the middle of a continent he'd never expected to see. He'd experienced fear, humiliation, and the peculiar relief that comes from surviving combat. But nothing in his military service, nothing in his indoctrination as a soldier of the Third Reich had prepared him for this moment. The hamburger wasn't just food, it was evidence of something the German High Command had either concealed or failed to understand. America wasn't starving. America wasn't rationing meat to soldiers while civilians went hungry. America was feeding its prisoners better than Germany fed its own troops. What Weber and the 200 men behind him couldn't have known, what the German General Staff had systematically misrepresented to its military throughout the war, was that this hamburger represented a fundamental strategic reality that would prove more demoralizing than any battlefield defeat. The United States possessed industrial and agricultural capacity so vast, so incomprehensibly beyond European understanding, that it could afford to feed enemy prisoners food that most German soldiers hadn't tasted in years. And this wasn't propaganda. This wasn't a special meal designed to impress. This was Saturday dinner at a medium-security POW camp in rural Kansas, one of 511 similar facilities across America, housing 425,000 German prisoners by 1945. Each of them is eating hamburgers. The story of how a simple sandwich psychologically dismantled the ideological foundations of Nazi soldiers begins not in 1943, but in 1939, when the German Wehrmacht invaded Poland, carrying rations that would define their expectations for the next 6 years. The standard German field ration, the Eiserne Portion, consisted of 250 grams of hardtack biscuits, 200 grams of preserved meat, 150 grams of dried vegetables, and 25 grams of coffee substitute. Total caloric value, approximately 3,000 calories, sufficient for sustained combat operations, but monotonous and increasingly unavailable as the war progressed. By 1942, Wehrmacht soldiers in Russia were subsisting on 2,000 calories daily. By 1944, front-line troops received 1,500. The Luftwaffe bomber crews that Weber had served with before transferring to armored units received marginally better rations, but fresh meat was rare. Beef was essentially non-existent outside officer mess halls. This deprivation wasn't accidental. Germany's agricultural production had been strained since 1940. The British naval blockade, while not as effective as in World War I, still restricted imports. The invasion of Russia, intended to secure Ukrainian grain and Caucasus oil, instead created massive logistical demands that drained resources. By 1943, German civilians were receiving 1,800 calories daily. Through rationing, soldiers in occupied territories received 2,000, and frontline troops theoretically received 3,000, but rarely saw those allocations materialize. The Wehrmacht fought hungry. Its soldiers knew hunger as a constant companion, expected hunger as the normal condition of military service, and assumed their enemies experienced the same deprivation. This assumption extended to American forces. German intelligence assessments in 1942 and 1943 described the United States as a nation struggling to mobilize, hampered by industrial conversion delays, suffering from material shortages that would limit military effectiveness. These assessments were catastrophically wrong, but they shaped Wehrmacht expectations about American military capability. German soldiers expected to face an enemy that was numerically superior but materially constrained. They expected Americans to fight like Europeans, rationed, improvising, making do with limited resources. Friedrich Weber had believed these assessments. His unit's intelligence briefings before deployment to Africa in late 1942 had described American forces as poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and likely to collapse under coordinated German assault. The briefings mentioned American industrial capacity, but framed it as potential, not reality. American factories would eventually produce vast quantities of equipment, the briefings suggested, but not yet, not in time to affect the North African campaign. German forces would defeat American units before industrial superiority could materialize. Kasserine Pass in February 1943 had seemed to confirm this assessment. The 21st Panzer Division had smashed through American defensive positions, destroying entire battalions, capturing hundreds of vehicles, and driving American forces back 50 miles. Weber's company had participated in the initial assault, breaking through the American lines with minimal casualties. The Americans had fought poorly, abandoned equipment, and retreated in disorder. Victory seemed inevitable. But then something changed. American forces that should have collapsed instead reorganized. Reinforcements arrived. Artillery that should have been depleted fired continuously, and within 3 days, German forces that had achieved a breakthrough were themselves retreating, harassed by American aircraft, shelled by American artillery, running out of fuel while American vehicles operated with apparent limitless supply. Weber had been captured during the retreat, separated from his unit when his half-track threw a tread near Thala. American infantry had surrounded his position. He'd surrendered, expecting harsh treatment, possibly summary execution. German propaganda had prepared him for American brutality. Instead, the American soldiers had given him water, offered him a cigarette, and directed him to a collection point where other prisoners sat under guard, unharmed, receiving medical attention for wounds. The journey to America had taken 6 weeks, transport by truck to Algiers, confinement in a temporary stockade, processing by military intelligence, transfer to a Liberty ship crossing the Atlantic, arrival in New York Harbor, train transport to Kansas. At each stage, Weber had expected conditions to worsen. Prison camps were supposed to be brutal. International law provided minimum standards, but Weber assumed these were theoretical. Germany's own prisoner camps, while generally compliant with Geneva Convention requirements for Western prisoners, were hardly comfortable. Russian prisoners faced systematic starvation. Weber expected similar treatment. Camp Concordia contradicted every expectation. The camp occupied 640 acres of former farmland, surrounded by a double fence topped with barbed wire and overlooked by guard towers at 200-yard intervals. Inside the perimeter sat rows of wooden barracks, each housing 60 men in bunks with mattresses and wool blankets. A separate building served as a mess hall. Another contained showers with hot water. A third held a library, recreation room, and canteen where prisoners could purchase items with camp script earned through work details. The camp had a football field, a boxing ring, and a small theater where prisoners staged performances. It looked like a military training facility, not a prison. The food was incomprehensible. Breakfast on Weber's first morning consisted of oatmeal, scrambled eggs, toast with butter, and coffee. Real coffee, not the grain-based substitute German soldiers drank. Lunch was vegetable soup, bread, and fruit. Dinner was pot roast with potatoes and carrots.
The portions were generous, second helpings were available. The mess hall threw away more food each day than Weber's company in Africa had seen in a week. Weber's initial response was disbelief. This couldn't be standard treatment. The Americans were fattening prisoners for propaganda purposes, perhaps planning to photograph them looking healthy for international observers. Or perhaps this was temporary, a processing phase before transfer to actual confinement. He and the other prisoners in his barracks discussed the situation each night, trying to reconcile what they experienced with what they'd been told about American poverty and industrial weakness. The Hamburger in May 1943 shattered the remaining illusions. It arrived without announcement, a regular menu item, not a special occasion. The mess sergeant had simply decided to serve hamburgers that evening, the way he might serve chicken the next day or fish on Friday. To the American staff, it was unremarkable. To the German prisoners, it was a revelation. Weber understood what ground beef represented. You didn't grind beef unless you had surplus. Grinding meat was what you did when you had so much that you could afford to turn premium cuts into convenient forms. German butchers grind meat, but only specific cuts, only when regulations allowed, and never in the quantities required to feed 1,200 prisoners. The hamburger wasn't just food, it was evidence of an agricultural system so productive that it could afford inefficiency. America had enough beef to grind it.
The prisoners ate in silence that first evening. Some had never tasted a hamburger, the dish being relatively uncommon in Germany. Others had eaten them in peacetime in cities as restaurant novelties. None had expected to eat one in a prison camp. The implications spread through the barracks that night in quiet conversations. If America fed prisoners hamburgers, what did American soldiers eat? If America had surplus beef for enemy captives, what resources were reaching the front lines? These questions drove a more fundamental realization that would corrode the ideological certainty German soldiers had carried into combat. Germany was losing not because of tactical failures or strategic mistakes, but because it was fighting an enemy that operated on a different economic plane. The United States wasn't constrained by the resource limitations that shaped European military planning. American military logistics didn't involve careful rationing and calculated risk. American forces could afford to be wasteful because waste didn't matter when production exceeded consumption by orders of magnitude. German prisoners began noticing details that confirmed this assessment. The American guards discarded food constantly. Leftover bread from meals went to trash bins, not storage. Damaged uniforms were thrown away, not repaired. Equipment that malfunctioned was replaced, not fixed. The camp motor pool contained trucks that would be considered fully operational by German standards, but were scheduled for maintenance because they'd reached arbitrary mileage thresholds. Everything about the American military operation suggested an abundance that German soldiers couldn't comprehend. The work details reinforced the lesson. Camp Concordia, like most POW facilities, contracted prisoners to local farmers to address labor shortages caused by military mobilization. Prisoners worked in wheat fields, sugar beet farms, and vegetable operations throughout Kansas. They were paid minimal wages in camp script, but the work provided direct exposure to American agricultural production. German prisoners harvested wheat fields that stretched to the horizon, operated combines that processed grain faster than entire German villages could manage by hand, and loaded trucks that delivered produce to processing facilities operating at scales that didn't exist in Europe. The farmers who supervised these work details were themselves revelations. They weren't professionals, weren't agricultural experts. They were ordinary men running family farms with equipment that would have been considered industrial machinery in Germany. They owned tractors, mechanical harvesters, trucks, and processing equipment worth more than most German farms' entire annual output.
And these farmers were complaining about fuel rationing, about labor shortages, about government price controls. They considered themselves deprived. They had no concept that their deprivation represented abundance that most German farmers couldn't imagine. Friedrich Weber worked a sugar beet harvest in September 1943 under the supervision of a Kansas farmer named Robert Harrison. Harrison was 43, too old for military service, running a 400-acre operation with his wife and 2 teenage sons. The farm produced sugar beets, wheat, and corn. Harrison owned 2 tractors, 3 trucks, and a mechanical harvester. He employed 6 German prisoners during harvest season, paying them minimal wages that the U.S. government set. Harrison treated the prisoners well, providing water during breaks, allowing them to rest in the shade when temperatures exceeded 95 degrees, and occasionally sharing lunch from his own supply. Weber spoke limited English, learned from a university course years earlier, and improved through 3 months of camp exposure. He and Harrison developed a working relationship that allowed basic communication. One afternoon in late September, during a lunch break, Harrison offered Weber half of his sandwich, roast beef on white bread with mustard. Weber accepted, eating mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Harrison, attempting conversation, asked if Weber had family in Germany. Weber answered carefully, aware that discussing personal details with captors was discouraged, but seeing no harm in general responses. He had a wife in Hamburg, 2 children, a son aged 6 and a daughter aged 4. He hadn't seen them since deploying to Africa in November 1942. He didn't know if they'd survived the RAF bombing raids that had devastated Hamburg in July. Harrison nodded sympathetically. He had family in the military, a brother serving with the Army Air Forces in England. Harrison asked if food was scarce in Germany. Weber paused, considering how to answer. The question was sensitive. Admitting German deprivation might be considered a criticism of the Reich. But Weber was tired, isolated from his command structure, and the irony of the question while eating an American farmer's surplus roast beef sandwich was too obvious to ignore. He answered honestly. Yes, food was scarce. His family had been rationed since 1939. The meat was rare. His children had never eaten beef in their lives. Butter was non-existent. Coffee was unavailable. Bread was made from mixed grains because wheat flour was reserved for military use. Harrison absorbed this information with an expression Weber couldn't interpret. Not satisfaction, not gloating, but something closer to confusion. Harrison asked how Germany expected to win the war if civilians were starving. Weber had no answer. The question had never occurred to him. German strategic planning assumed victory through military superiority, tactical excellence, and willpower. Resource considerations were a problem for logistics officers to solve. Harrison's question implied that logistics determined outcomes, that wars were won by the side that could feed its population while supporting military operations. This was a profoundly different understanding of warfare than what Weber had been taught.
The conversation stayed with Weber through the autumn of 1943 and into 1944. He began paying attention to information that previously he'd dismissed or rationalized. The camp received newspapers, censored, but providing basic war news. The papers described American production figures, 50,000 aircraft in 1943, projected 100,000 in 1944, 45,000 tanks in 1943, hundreds of Liberty ships, thousands of trucks, millions of rifles. The numbers seemed exaggerated, propaganda designed to demoralize. But Weber was living inside an American logistical system. He saw the trucks that brought supplies to camp, counted the new vehicles that replaced old ones, and noted the construction of additional barracks when prisoner populations increased. The numbers might actually be accurate. By spring 1944, Camp Concordia held 2,400 German prisoners, double its initial capacity. New arrivals came from the Italian campaign, captured during the Rome offensive. They brought reports of overwhelming American material superiority, of German defensive positions buried under artillery bombardments that continued for hours without pause, of American supply columns that stretched for miles, of ammunition expenditure that suggested infinite reserves. These reports matched Weber's observations of American logistics. The pattern was clear. America was outproducing Germany by ratios that made continued resistance futile. Weber wasn't alone in this realization. Across American POW camps, German prisoners were reaching similar conclusions through similar observations. The food, the waste, the casual abundance that characterized American military operations all pointed to the same strategic reality: Germany couldn't win. The war would continue until German military capacity collapsed, but the outcome was determined. America could afford to fight indefinitely. Germany was burning through its last reserves. This realization created a psychological crisis for prisoners who had believed in German victory, who had justified their military service through conviction that the Reich's cause was righteous and achievable. The hamburgers, the roast beef sandwiches, the discarded bread, and the surplus equipment all testified that German leadership had either lied or been catastrophically ignorant about American capacity. Either conclusion undermined trust in command authority. If German leaders had lied about American weakness, what else had been falsified? If German leaders had been genuinely ignorant about American strength, how could their strategic planning be trusted? The psychological impact manifested in different ways across the prisoner population. Some prisoners became openly defeatist, stating plainly that Germany had lost and that continued resistance was pointless. These prisoners cooperated enthusiastically with camp authorities, volunteered information during interrogations, and expressed willingness to remain in America after the war rather than return to Germany. Camp administrators called them converts and separated them from the general population to prevent conflict. Other prisoners doubled down on Nazi ideology, insisting that German defeat was impossible regardless of material disadvantages, that willpower and racial superiority would overcome logistical constraints. These prisoners maintained strict discipline within the camps, enforced Nazi protocols among the prisoner population, and occasionally attacked prisoners they considered traitors. Camp administrators called them hardliners and isolated them in separate facilities where their influence couldn't spread. Most prisoners, including Weber, fell between these extremes. They didn't become American sympathizers, didn't abandon German identity, but couldn't maintain belief in German victory when every day provided fresh evidence of American material superiority. The hamburgers kept arriving, the abundance continued. The lesson was reinforced with every meal. The psychological transformation accelerated after D-Day in June 1944. News of the Normandy invasion reached Camp Concordia through newspapers and radio broadcasts. German prisoners understood the strategic implications. The Western Allies had established a permanent foothold in France. German forces would now fight on two fronts against enemies with overwhelming material advantages. The Eastern Front consumed vast resources, holding back Soviet advances. The Italian Front tied down divisions that couldn't be redeployed. The Western Front would require forces Germany didn't have, supplied by industry that couldn't match demand, fed by agriculture that couldn't support both military and civilian populations. Weber received a letter from his wife in August 1944, the first communication in 18 months. The Red Cross had facilitated delivery through neutral Switzerland. The letter was brief, censored, revealing little specific information, but confirming that his family had survived the Hamburg bombings. They were living in temporary housing, food was scarce, but their children were healthy. The letter included no political content,
no commentary on the war, but its tone was resigned. His wife wasn't expecting his return soon. She was preparing for extended separation, possibly permanent.
Weber wrote back immediately, his response equally censored, limited to personal matters. He couldn't tell her about the food at Camp Concordia, couldn't describe the abundance he witnessed daily, couldn't explain that German defeat was inevitable because America possessed resources that made victory impossible. The censors would remove those statements. But he wanted to tell her, wanted to explain that she should prepare for Germany's collapse, that she should plan for occupation, that she should survive whatever came because he wouldn't be returning until the war ended, and the ending was now predictable. The hamburgers continued through the autumn and winter of 1944. They weren't served every day, but they appeared regularly, along with steaks, roast chicken, pork chops, and other meals that demonstrated America's agricultural capacity. Each meal reinforced the lesson. The prisoners gained weight. Medical examinations showed improved health compared to their condition at capture. Men who had been malnourished in North Africa or Italy recovered. The improvement was visible, measurable, and undeniable. In December 1944, news reached the camp of the German offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. German forces had achieved tactical surprise, broken through American lines, and threatened significant advances. Some prisoners celebrated, seeing the offensive as proof that Germany retained the capacity for strategic operations. Weber didn't share the enthusiasm. The offensive, however successful initially, couldn't change strategic fundamentals. German forces had achieved a breakthrough but couldn't sustain it. American reinforcements would arrive, American artillery would pound German positions, and American aircraft would dominate the skies once the weather cleared. The pattern had repeated throughout the war. German tactical excellence couldn't overcome American material superiority. The offensive failed within weeks, confirming Weber's assessment. German forces retreated, having accomplished nothing except delaying inevitable defeat. The prisoners who had celebrated the initial success fell silent. The hardliners continued insisting that Germany would develop miracle weapons, that new aircraft and tanks would reverse the military situation, and that victory remained possible through technological breakthroughs. These claims sounded increasingly desperate. By January 1945, Camp Concordia held 3,100 prisoners. New arrivals came from the Bulge, captured during the failed offensive. They brought accounts of American firepower that exceeded anything previously experienced. German positions had been obliterated by artillery concentrations that fired thousands of rounds per hour. American infantry advanced behind Sherman tanks that appeared in limitless numbers, each destroyed vehicle immediately replaced. American supply columns operated continuously, delivering ammunition, fuel, and food without apparent constraint. The new prisoners adapted quickly to camp conditions. They expressed relief at being captured, gratitude for the food, and acknowledgement that Germany was finished. The ideological commitment that had characterized earlier prisoners was absent. These men had fought in late 1944 with full awareness of Germany's strategic situation. They'd seen German cities destroyed by bombing, witnessed refugee columns fleeing Russian advances, and understood that the Reich was collapsing. Capture represented escape from a losing cause. Friedrich Weber was selected for repatriation planning in February 1945. Camp administrators identified prisoners who had demonstrated cooperative behavior and a lack of Nazi affiliation. These prisoners would be processed for early return to Germany once hostilities ended. Weber qualified based on his conduct, his minimal party involvement. He'd never joined the Nazi Party, serving as Wehrmacht personnel without political affiliation, and his expressed willingness to assist reconstruction efforts. The designation meant little practically, since all prisoners would return eventually, but it indicated American assessment of his reliability. Germany surrendered in May 1945.
The news reached Camp Concordia through radio broadcasts on May 8th. The prisoners assembled in the recreation yard to hear the announcement. Some wept, some sat in silence, some expressed relief. The camp administrators maintained security protocols, anticipating possible unrest, but no incidents occurred. The prisoners understood the war was over. Whatever came, the fighting had stopped. Repatriation proceeded slowly through 1945 and 1946. Transportation capacity was limited, Europe was devastated, and American authorities prioritized returning prisoners who had family connections or skills needed for reconstruction. Weber remained at Camp Concordia through the autumn of 1945, working farm details and awaiting processing. The food continued unchanged. The hamburgers still arrived. American abundance hadn't diminished with war's end. Weber finally returned to Germany in January 1946, transported by ship to Bremerhaven and released to British occupation authorities. He made his way to Hamburg, finding his family living in a partially reconstructed apartment building. The city was in ruins. The harbor was destroyed. Food was scarce. British occupation forces provided basic rations, but conditions were desperate. His children, now aged 9 and 7, were malnourished, pale, and surviving on 1,200 calories daily. His wife had aged a decade in 3 years. Weber shared his American experience cautiously. His wife asked about the camps, assuming they had been brutal. Weber struggled to explain that he'd eaten better in captivity than she had in freedom, that American prisoners had received food her children had never tasted, that the disparity between American abundance and German deprivation had been the most demoralizing aspect of imprisonment. She didn't understand initially. How could prison camps be comfortable? Weber tried to convey the psychological impact of those hamburgers, the way each meal had testified to Germany's inevitable defeat, the way American waste had demonstrated German irrelevance. The conversation was difficult, constrained by her experiences during bombing raids and his experience of American plenty. They inhabited different psychological spaces, shaped by radically different material conditions. Eventually, Weber stopped trying to explain. The experience couldn't be conveyed to someone who hadn't witnessed American operations directly. You had to see the trucks, count the equipment, and eat the hamburgers to understand what those material advantages meant strategically. Weber found work in Hamburg's reconstruction efforts, eventually securing employment as a mechanic in a rebuilt factory. He didn't discuss his American captivity publicly. The topic was sensitive. Germans who had been POWs sometimes faced suspicion from those who had remained in Germany through the occupation. Weber kept silent, resuming civilian life, focusing on supporting his family through the difficult years of reconstruction. But he never forgot the hamburgers. Decades later, when American fast food chains opened in Germany in the 1960s, when McDonald's and Burger King became common, when his children and grandchildren ate hamburgers as casual meals, Weber would remember May 1943 in Camp Concordia, Kansas, the moment when a simple sandwich had revealed a strategic truth that the German command had concealed or failed to understand. America hadn't defeated Germany through superior tactics or better soldiers. America had won by outproducing German industry by ratios that made military excellence irrelevant. The psychological impact of American POW treatment extended beyond individual prisoners. Historians examining post-war Germany identified a phenomenon they called the POW effect. Returnees who had experienced American abundance firsthand became proponents of economic reconstruction along American models, advocates for market systems and industrial development. These men had seen what capitalist systems could produce. They understood that Germany's future depended on economic integration with the West, not ideological commitments to discredited systems. Friedrich Weber was one among 425,000 German prisoners held in American camps during the war. Each of them ate similar meals, witnessed similar abundance, and reached similar conclusions about relative economic capacity. They returned to Germany carrying knowledge that reshaped their understanding of the war and Germany's place in the post-war world. The American treatment of prisoners, intended simply as compliance with Geneva Convention requirements and practical utilization of available resources, functionally became a massive re-education program that taught German prisoners that the Reich's ideology had been built on fundamentally false assumptions about economic capacity and national power.
The hamburgers weren't meant to be psychological weapons. They were simply what American cooks prepared when feeding large groups, but they accomplished what propaganda couldn't. They demonstrated American capacity through direct experience. Every German prisoner who returned home carried memories of American abundance that contradicted Nazi narratives about American weakness. Those memories influenced political development, economic policy, and cultural orientation in post-war West Germany. The irony was complete. Germany had spent 12 years under Nazi rule being told that racial superiority and willpower would overcome material disadvantages. The Wehrmacht had fought believing that German tactical excellence would defeat numerically superior but resource-poor enemies. German prisoners had been captured, expecting harsh treatment from a weakened opponent. Instead, they'd eaten hamburgers, and those hamburgers had taught a lesson that 6 years of warfare couldn't, that modern war was won by industrial capacity, that strategic planning required realistic assessment of economic resources, and that ideological commitment couldn't substitute for agricultural and industrial production. In university history departments today, the POW camps of World War II are studied as examples of psychological warfare achieved through humane treatment. The camps demonstrated American values, exhibited American capacity, and transformed prisoners into unwitting witnesses to American power. The effect was unintentional but profound. German prisoners returned home having experienced a system that contradicted everything their leadership had taught them. That experience shaped Reconstruction, influenced political development, and contributed to West Germany's eventual orientation toward Western economic and political systems. Friedrich Weber died in Hamburg in 1987, aged 78, having lived through Germany's devastation and Reconstruction. He rarely discussed his war service and never spoke publicly about his captivity. But he told his grandchildren stories about America, about the abundance he'd witnessed, about camps where prisoners ate better than soldiers. He described the hamburgers with precision, remembered the taste, and recalled the psychological impact. Those memories had stayed with him for 44 years, vivid and powerful. The hamburger hadn't just been food, it had been evidence. Evidence that the Reich had lied, that German leadership had been catastrophically wrong about American capacity, that the war had been lost before it began because Germany was fighting an enemy that operated on a different economic scale. That evidence, delivered in the form of ground beef on a white bun, had accomplished what battlefield defeats couldn't. It had shattered the ideological certainty that sustained German resistance. 378,000 German prisoners returned home from American camps between 1945 and 1946. Each of them had eaten American food, witnessed American waste, experienced American abundance. They carried that knowledge back to a devastated nation that needed to understand why it had lost. The answer wasn't complex. Germany had lost because it was fighting an enemy that could afford to feed prisoners hamburgers, an enemy that possessed agricultural production so vast that it could waste food on captives, an enemy whose industrial capacity made German efforts irrelevant regardless of tactical excellence.
The death ray had promised to make conventional warfare obsolete. The superweapon would revolutionize combat. But the war was won by a nation that could deliver hamburgers to prison camps in rural Kansas, that could afford to feed enemy soldiers better than those soldiers had eaten in years, that operated with such surplus that waste didn't matter. Simple, obvious, devastating. The hamburger that Friedrich Weber ate on May 8, 1943, didn't just feed a hungry prisoner, it delivered a strategic lesson that would resonate for the rest of his life. Germany hadn't lost because its soldiers weren't brave, or its tactics weren't sound, or its weapons weren't effective. Germany had lost because it was fighting an enemy for whom abundance was normal, waste was acceptable, and hamburgers were just Saturday dinner. And that made all the difference.